We're looking at the Persian Empire, where the story of Esther takes place. I mentioned before about how Israel was on top of the world, and then they kind of pushed God away, and then the Babylonian Empire, led by Nebuchadnezzar, came, and they overtook Israel, and then they lost power to the Persian Empire, who rose, and they began to be the superpower of the world. And so around this time, 475, 500 BC, the Persian Empire was led by King Xerxes, who was the most powerful man in the world. And as you know, as we read the story, he banished the queen, and so he had this kind of beauty contest that lasted for about 4 years. This young Jewish orphan girl whose parents died, and who was basically, her family was captive for years and years. She arose to the top of this beauty contest, and she becomes queen through God's divine intervention. And she has a cousin who's like a father to her named Mordecai. So Esther and Mordecai, Jewish people. Mordecai works in the palace, and he hears that there's a plot to assassinate the king, and he reports that to Esther. Esther tells the king, and they kill the two guys that were going to try to kill the king. Later, we talked last week about how King Xerxes appointed this disgusting, vile person to be the second in command. Anybody remember what his name was? Haman, that's right. His name was Haman. He was number 2, and remember, he acted like number 2. He was a horrible human being. He was an Amalekite who absolutely despises the Jewish people, and so he finds out that Mordecai is Jewish, and Mordecai won't bow to Haman because it's against his religion, and so he wants to kill not only Mordecai, but every Jewish person in the entire world. He successfully plans this plot, and he bribes the king with a whole bunch of silver to kill every Jew in the world. And so Mordecai finds out about this. He begs Esther. He says, listen, you're the queen. You have to go to the king. You have to tell him now that you're a Jewish woman and that your life is in danger. You have to beg him for mercy. And Esther says, I can't do that. You can't just approach the king. You know how this works. I'll be killed. And we closed last week with Mordecai telling Esther, he says, listen, who knows? You were probably appointed to be the queen for a time such as this. And we know that was exactly what happened. So we're going to pick up the story today at that point where the queen says, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to approach the king. And this is what we read. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to the 4th chapter of Esther. So Mordecai just gets done telling Esther that her whole life's purpose, everything that she had been born, and the reason that she was beautiful, the reason that she won this contest, the reason that she was appointed as the queen of the Persian Empire was for a time such as this to save the Jewish people. And so we pick up the story here, Esther 4, verse 15. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. He says, go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. So we're going to go right into lesson number 1, life lesson number 1. And I want you to understand this as we read the Bible together. The first lesson is when your life is committed to God, then God determines your life's results. And let me explain this. Esther, she says, listen, I'm going to go to the king. And I'm going to do what you say. And if I die, I die. And I'm telling you that when your life is wholly and completely committed to the Lord, when you say, God, this is what your word says, I'm going to revolve my life around your word. I'm going to try to do my best to obey your commands. I'm going to worship you. I'm going to serve you because I know my life is in your hands. The only reason I have hope for eternity is because your son, Jesus, died for me. The least I could do is commit my life to you. When you do that, everything that happens in your life from that point on is the results of God's plan in your life. When you're committed to God's work, your life, in the consequences, the trials, the good things, the bad things, the people you meet, the churches you go to, the schools, the places of work or whatever, it's all part of a bigger plan that God has for you. And so, even if that means going through trials, even if it means getting sick, and like Esther says, even if it means dying, if it's a part of a bigger plan in God's whole kingdom that He can see that I can't, then I'm ready for that. This was the position that Esther took. She's like, listen, I'm going to go to the king, and if it means me dying in order to save God's people, I'm ready for that, because I'm committed to the Lord, and whatever happens, happens. And as Christians, we have to understand that we may not like the results. We may pray, or we may seek the Lord, we may go through trials, we may lose our job, we may lose a loved one, we may get sick, we may go to the hospital and hear something detrimental. But if we're in God's will, and if we're standing on the Word of God, and we're committed to His will, no matter what you go through, those results belong to the Lord. And God sees something bigger than you can see. You may not understand those results. You may not like those results. Those results may end up with you being sick or even dying. But the results are a part of something huge that God can see that you can't see. And it always will be for the benefit of either yourself or the people around you. So Esther and the Jews, they pray and they fast for 3 days. 3 days and nights. Right? This isn't just like, well, I'm gonna give up milkshakes for 3 days. That's my kind of fast. But this is the real deal fast. So, and she was prepared for any result. She's like, I'm going to fast. I'm going to get close to God. I'm going to know that whatever happens is exactly what God wants. And this is what we read in the next chapter 5, verse 1. On the third day of the fast, Esther put on her royal robes. She entered the inner court of the palace, just across from the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, he welcomed her and held out the gold scepter to her. So Esther approached and touched the end of the scepter, and the king asked her, "What do you want, Queen Esther? What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." So, instead of Esther approaching the king in an incorrect way and risking her life and him responding in anger and possibly killing her, what does he do? He offers her half the kingdom. So lesson number 2 that I want to share with you guys is that fasting and prayer works. Fasting and prayer absolutely works. Some of you guys may not have been in this particular situation because you've never, won a 4-year beauty contest and became queen of the world's empire, but you may have been in a very important situation. Maybe you've gotten bad news from the doctor, or maybe somebody you love is in extreme danger. Maybe you have a life-changing decision before you, and you really, really need God's guidance. You really need God's favor. The thing to do is to fast. Fasting starves your flesh. Now let me explain this for a second. Why is that important? You see, when we're sinners, we're sinners from the day that we're born, and we make bad mistakes. We even as Christians, we still go on to sin. Those sins are taking place in our flesh, in the sinful part of who we are. See, we have a spirit as born-again Christians that's absolutely perfect. We don't sin in our spirit, we sin in our flesh. And when we die, the body says that our flesh and blood goes down to the grave, and all of that sin and all of that wickedness that makes us, a part of our sinful nature, that all goes away, and it's our spirit that's alive. And so when we fast, we're starving that flesh part of us. And you know what that feels like, because if you ever go 3 days without eating or even drinking water or anything like that, your body is just, it's so uncomfortable. You're miserable. Your body is like eating itself up, and you feel terrible. Well, it's that part of you that's sinful. You're crucifying that part of you, and then when you do that, you strengthen the spiritual part of you. You strengthen the part of you that God connects with. And so when your flesh is being crucified, is being starved in that sense, you're strengthening the part of you that connects with God. And so you may remember a story in the Bible where the disciples tried to cast out these evil spirits, and they couldn't do it. And they go to Jesus and they say, "Jesus, we're trying to cast these spirits out. We couldn't do it." And Jesus goes over and he casts them out. And what did Jesus say to him? He says, "Listen, some spirits only come out through prayer and fasting." So fasting takes you to another level of connecting with God. When you're in a major decision, a major crisis in your life, like Esther was, don't just pray, but sacrifice something. Crucify your flesh and tell God, this is a very serious thing. I need to be one with you right now, and I'm going to go through a day, 2 days, 3 days of fasting so that you and I can connect and I can be in prayer, and that you will hear my prayer and honor my prayer. And that's what Esther did. Not only Esther, but Mordecai and all the Jews in the land there. So God answers Esther's prayer. Listen to what God does, because when you pray and you fast like this, God will do these cool things to intervene. He put the king in a position to call upon the queen. First of all, I don't know what it's like to be a king in an empire, but we see the movies where they're always sitting on the throne. How often are they really sitting on a throne? And why are they just sitting on a throne? Like, it's not like they have a tablet to play on, or they don't have, you're just sitting there basically saying, yeah, I'm the king, I get to sit on the throne. But I would think after 20 minutes, you're like, okay, let's go play volleyball or something. I'm bored, But he just happened to be sitting on the throne facing the entrance that Esther, after 3 days of fasting, came in. Right? Just happened by coincidence. And then when he saw Esther, his heart melted. Like, listen, when we read the story of Esther, King Xerxes, as powerful, as big and bad as he is, as much authority as he has, there's something about Esther, when he lays his eyes on this girl, his heart just melts. And he didn't even get any words. Like, he goes, look, I'll give you half of everything I got. What do you want? He can't even control himself. It's not just Esther. It's the result of Esther's praying and fasting. Because what God does is he does something to the heart of Xerxes when he sees this woman of God. And it melts her heart. And I don't know if you've ever saw your spouse, and when you first saw them, God did that in your heart. And he's like, oh my gosh, there's something special here. God's doing that. Or not even as far as attraction goes. Maybe you see a child doing something so sweet. They help somebody up, or they encourage somebody, and it melts your heart. That's God doing that because He wants you to bless that child. So God will intervene in ways like this, just like He did with Xerxes and Esther. So Esther's fast worked. The king offered Esther anything she wanted, up to half the kingdom. And so here's the story. Esther requests a banquet. She says, if you don't mind, I want to have a banquet for you and for Haman. So just the three of us. I want to have a banquet. We're going to have some food. And I'll talk to you tonight about what my request is. Now, as we follow the story, you've got to understand that Haman, the evil number 2 Haman, he doesn't know that Esther's Jewish. He doesn't know that Esther is Mordecai's cousin. He just hates Mordecai. He hates all Jewish people because he's a racist Amalekite. And so he doesn't know any of these things. So Esther is inviting him and the king to a banquet, and he thinks this is the greatest thing in the world. And so at the banquet, the king says, all right, Esther, what can I do for you? And she says, listen, this is a really serious request that I want to ask of you, so would you mind if we meet again tomorrow night? It's really important to me. The king says, absolutely, you got it. So he says, Haman, you and I, we're going to meet in another banquet tomorrow night. And so that is when Esther is going to reveal what she asks. So during this 24-hour period, there's a lot that happens. Let's read on from verse 9. Haman was a happy man as he left the banquet. But when he saw Mordecai sitting at the palace gate, not standing up or trembling nervous before him, Haman became furious. You remember that everybody's supposed to bow to Haman. Mordecai wouldn't do it. Verse 10 says, however, Haman restrained himself and he went home. And then Haman gathered together his friends and Zeresh's wife, and he boasted to them about his great wealth and his many children. He bragged about the honors the king had given him and about how he had been promoted over all other nobles and officials. And then Haman added, and that's not all. Queen Esther invited only me and the king himself to the banquet she prepared for us, and she has invited me to dine with her and the king again tomorrow. Then he added, but this is all worth nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in this just sitting there at the palace gate. So Haman's wife, Zeresh, and all of his friends suggested, set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall, and in the morning ask the king to impale Mordecai on it. Now, Haman was excited when he left the banquet. He was thinking, wow, I have the queen's favor. She invited just me and the king. She must really like me. I'm doing a good job. But as soon as he went out and he saw Mordecai, he was furious. And so they put up this pole that's 75 feet high. And just to give you a little reference, it's 3 times higher than the ceiling. That's a big pole. And what they want to do is they want to stick Mordecai on there and spear him and let him just sit there and die in front of the entire part of the empire there. And so Now you know that Haman already listens, or the king already listens to Haman. He pretty much gives Haman free reign of whatever he wants to do. So the king would have had no problem of doing this because Haman really wanted it. Haman wanted to press him a little more. He might have offered him more money, and the king was money hungry, so he would have done it. No big deal. So Haman was probably thinking, we're setting up this poll. I can't wait. Tomorrow morning I'm going to go in. I'm going to tell the king, hey, will you let me impale this man because he's terrible. He won't bow, blah, blah, blah. And so he's probably sleeping good that night thinking tomorrow's a big day. We get to kill Mordecai. But that night, another coincidence happens. Okay, let's read the next chapter, Esther 6, in the first verse. So listen, that night the king had trouble sleeping. So he ordered an attendant to bring the book of the history of his reign so it could be read to him. Now, I told you before, it might have been a couple weeks ago, everything that happened in the empire was recorded by this author who would just basically follow the king around, and he would write down the events of what happened. Wars and certain things, the beauty contest, all of those things that were recorded. So this night, the king couldn't sleep. He couldn't sleep. And so he says, hey, bring somebody in here, read me back some of the stories about my kingdom. A little arrogant, but whatever. Verse 2 says this, in those records he discovered an account of how Mordecai had exposed the plot of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the eunuchs who guarded the door of the king's private quarters. They had plotted to assassinate King Xerxes. So he recalled that, wait a minute, there's a guy in the kingdom named Mordecai that saved my life 5 years ago. He forgot all about it. And so he says in verse 3, what reward or recognition did we ever get from Mordecai for this? The king asked his attendants. And they replied, nothing has ever been done for him. So listen, the king just can't sleep that night. Does God have something to do with that? Yeah. The king just happens to say, hey, will you read me back some history, some stories about my kingdom? I've been a king for about 10 years now, so read me some of the stories so that I can get some rest. And so throughout that 10-year history, they just happened to read to the king the story about when Mordecai saved his life. There were two guys trying to kill him, and Mordecai turned him in, and it's all just a big coincidence, right? God has nothing to do with this, you would think. Of course God has everything to do with it. So think about this for a second. Mordecai was never rewarded for saving the king's life. I don't know why he wasn't rewarded. I don't know if God 5 years prior made it that way so that he purposely was not rewarded. But Mordecai didn't say, well, I'm upset. I deserve money. I deserve this or that. Mordecai was just doing what was natural to him. He was a loyal servant to the king and to the Lord. And so he never got a reward for saving the king's life. They just kind of forgot about it. Maybe the king was preoccupied. But this really worked out in Mordecai's favor. And I want you to know that sometimes in your life and in my life, you're always doing good things. You maybe in your family situation or people that you know, how many of you guys always have to be the bigger person, it seems like? Right? Or you have to be the Christian example because there are many in your family that aren't the good Christian example. And so the things that they do doesn't necessarily mean that you should do or engage in. And maybe you're always giving, and people are always taking. There's people in your life that just literally suck the life out of you, and it just seems like you're giving and giving, and nothing ever God is always keeping track of that. Everything that you do, every good deed that you do or have done, God has it all on record. Every single thing that you do, big or small, God has recorded everything that you've ever done. And listen, you will be rewarded for every little good deed that you've ever done in your whole life. As long as you haven't bragged about it and done it for the wrong motives, God will reward you. Now, that reward may be instantly. You save somebody's life and somebody's recording it. It's going to be on the news. You get instant recognition for that. Maybe something like that. And maybe something that you never, ever, ever get rewarded for until you get to heaven. And then God has treasures that you get to keep for all of eternity. He says, listen, nobody saw what you did when you helped that family in need, but I saw it, and I love the fact that you didn't go out and try to get a bunch of recognition for it, and I wanted to bless you publicly, since you did this privately, and so you get rewarded like that. But sometimes you get rewarded in the time that's most beneficial to you. that fits into God's plan, and that's the case with Mordecai. So Mordecai did something great for the king. The king forgot about it, but 5 years later, he remembered it, and it just so happened to be the night before Mordecai was going to be killed. Is that a coincidence? Mordecai, that next morning, was going to be impaled on a 75-foot pole. But the king had some people read him a story, and in that story, he remembered that this man Mordecai, out of all the millions of people in his empire, this man Mordecai saved his life, and he decides, I want to honor Mordecai. So the king is thinking about how he can honor Mordecai, while Haman is thinking, I'm going to go in there and ask the king to impale Mordecai. It's getting good, right? So the next day, the king decides he wants to finally honor Mordecai, and Haman just happens to come into town to ask the king to kill Mordecai. Love, you can't make this up. This is awesome. Verse 4 says this. The king just realizes that, hey, we never honored Mordecai. And he says, okay, who's that in the outer court? The king inquired. As it happened, I love that, as it happened, Haman had just arrived in the outer court of the palace to ask the king to impale Mordecai on the pole that he had prepared. So the attendants replied to the king, Haman is out in the outer court. Bring him in, the king ordered. So this is going to be really good. Now, please imagine this scene with me. This is what dreams are made of right here. Haman, the wicked, evil number 2, is going to the king to say, King Xerxes, if you don't mind, there's a man in your kingdom who's really causing a lot of problems. I've set up a pole, and he's disrespecting you, he's disrespecting me. I say that we kill him because, he's really a cancer to your empire. And so if you wouldn't mind, let me go ahead and do that. And normally that would be no problem. The king already took his ring off and gave it to Haman and said, hey, write whatever law you want. I trust you. So in Haman's mind, it was a done deal. But as he was walking in to request this of the king is saying, hey, bring Haman in. I want to do something special for Mordecai. Oh, I love it. So before Haman can even get the request to kill Mordecai, this is what he says, hey, Mordecai, or Haman, what should I do to honor somebody that really is special to me? Haman thinks he's talking about him, so he says this in verse 7. Haman replies, if the king wishes to honor somebody, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as the horse that the king himself has ridden, one with a royal emblem on its head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robes and led through the city square on the king's horse. Have the officials shout out as they go, this is what the king does for somebody he wishes to honor. And so, using Haman's own words, the king says to Haman, yeah, everything you just said, there's a man named Mordecai in the kingdom. I want you to go do that for him. Oh, I love it. I love it. Imagine the jaw dropping when Haman was about to say, can I kill this man? But instead the king says, no, I want you to go honor this man. He never even gets that word out. There's a picture that I have that explains exactly what just happened here. Go ahead and put that picture up. Yeah, the tides have definitely turned in this story. Amen? Yeah. I'm sorry if you're visiting today and wondering what kind of church this is. But we do memes. So the tides have definitely turned. And so Haman, who went in thinking, oh man, I'm going to get revenge, this is going to be the happiest day of my life, now has to go around, think of it, picture it now, with a horse, leading Mordecai, the person he absolutely despises, and shouting, this is what happens when this is how the king honors somebody that he loves, or that deserves it. And he's got the king's robe on, and he's got the king's, crown and all that stuff. And it was Haman's idea, and he has to strut him around and brag about him to everybody in the whole kingdom. And Mordecai is just sitting up there looking at him like, oh yeah, you love this. Verse 12, listen. After Mordecai returned to the palace gate, but Haman hurried home, dejected and completely humiliated. So lesson number 3, the last lesson I want to talk about, is that pride comes before the fall. Amen? Pride comes before the fall. You hear it all the time. But listen, seriously, the person that you're bitter towards, the person that you may have the biggest problem in your life, with maybe the person that God sends you to and says, "Look, I want you to show this person love and kindness. I want you to show them something that the world wouldn't show them." You know, anybody can show anger towards somebody who shows you anger. Anybody can give money to somebody that, that has given you money, but I want you to do something for him that he would never do for you. Because when you do that, you're acting more in God's character than in man's character. And so, if you have bitterness towards somebody and you say, "God, I will talk to anybody, I will do anything except for this person," guess who God's going to send you to? Yeah, that person. I guarantee it. If you say, "God, I'll go to anywhere except for this place. I don't want anything to do with this place," you might as well pack your bags. You're going to that place. You can ask Jonah about that. It works. And so you have to learn how to deal with people. You have to learn how to deal with people who aren't treating you well. And you have to, I'm not saying, let people walk all over you, but I mean, you can't let them ruin who you are. Haman was destroyed because of his hatred for Mordecai and for Jewish people. It killed him, ultimately. Let's keep reading. After he gets done strutting around Mordecai all through the town to honor him, Haman immediately has to go to the second banquet that Esther has planned. Okay, you following the story with me? Okay, so that night, he goes to the second meeting. Esther 7, verse 1 says this. "So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's second banquet. On the second occasion, while they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, 'Tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it's half the kingdom.' Queen Esther replied, 'If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had been merely sold as slaves, I could remain quiet, for that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king.' And the next verse says, 'Who would do such a thing?' King Xerxes demanded. 'Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you?' Now remember, Haman didn't know that Queen Esther was Jewish. He didn't know that she was related to Mordecai. So imagine Haman he's at this beautiful banquet, right? He's chomping down on this prime rib or whatever they're eating, and he's drinking his wine. He's drinking out of the gold goblets and everything, and he's just on top of the world. He's a little humiliated. He just had some egg on his face with Mordecai, but he still, at least he has the queen's favor, right? He's in the thing, and then all of a sudden the queen comes out, and for the first time he realizes something he never knew. Oh my Lord, the queen's Jewish, and I just made a law to kill the queen and all the Jewish people. And as he spits his prime rib out, his wine or whatever else he's got, he knows he is in big, big, big trouble. And so the nationality that he just wanted to destroy just happens to be the same nationality as the most powerful woman in the world, who is holding a banquet with him and just the king, and he's a little bit outnumbered. Verse 6 says, Esther replied, "This wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy." And Haman grew pale with fright before the king and the queen. Haman knew at that point he wasn't eating no more prime rib after that. He wasn't drinking no more bottles of champagne or anything like that. He wasn't going to be dressed in fine robes. He wasn't going to be wealthy. All the money that he had, all the power that he had, those days were about gone, because this was the biggest bombshell that could. This was a lot worse than marching Mordecai through the city, right? This was. And let me tell you something about King Xerxes. Xerxes was many things. He was a sexist. He was a narcissist. He was money hungry. He was a bad man. He was brutal. But there was no person in the world that he loved more than Esther. And in some weird way, Xerxes was Esther's knight in shining armor. Xerxes was Esther's protector. Believe it or not. I mean, yeah, he was weird by our standards. We would say that's completely inappropriate, what he does. But in some weird way in the empire, when he looked at the queen, his heart just melted, and he'd never felt like that with any person in his life, and he loved her more than anybody, offered her half the kingdom. And so the thought that this man is going to kill his wife was not good. It did not end well. And so the king, before he can even think, what am I going to do to you? You're done, and he starts to just begin to think about, what could I do to him? I got to tell you, my favorite part in this whole story is right here, in verse 9. Then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, said, well, Haman has set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. He intended to use it to impale Mordecai, you know, the man who saved the king from assassination. Then impale Haman on it, the king ordered. And so they impaled Haman on the pole that had set up for Mordecai. This guy's my hero. I don't even care. Harbona, he's like the one friend that says, you know, I hate to stir the pot, you know. I hate drama, but they're always causing drama. Yeah? I don't want to stir the pot, but and I don't want to be in your business, but there just happens to be a big pole that he set up outside, and you know, he was going to kill the guy, and you remember he's the guy that saved your life. I mean, it's not my business. It's nothing to do with me, but. And he's like that. He just gets it out, and the king says, yes, that's it. Stick him on that thing like a shish kebab. He's done. Oh, how can we joke about that, I guess? Remember when Esther was in the beauty contest, and the Bible says that the eunuchs all loved her. They just fell in love with her. Her attitude, her charm, her personality, her strength, everything that she had. The eunuchs, who, you know, eunuchs are castrated males who work in the service of the queen's women or the king's women, you know, so that they can be trusted. They all fell in love with Esther. So not only was Xerxes furious with Haman when he found out that Haman wanted to kill Esther and all the Jews, the eunuch said, that's our girl. You are not touching that girl. And so Harbona speaks up and is like, hey, I got an idea. Let's stick him out on this 75-foot pole. So as we close this story today, I think it was 2 weeks ago I read this verse, and listen to this again. Proverbs 26:27 says, whoever digs a pit will fall into it. And who rolls a stone will have it roll back on him. Think about the pit that Haman dug out of his hatred for the Jewish people. He absolutely hated them so much that it consumed his whole life. He couldn't process his hatred. And that's the way Amalekites were. That's why God ordered them to be killed 1,000 years prior to this. And so his hatred for Malachi took his focus off of anything that was logical, and he dug this pit that was meant for Malachi to fall into it, but Haman ended up falling into it, literally. He put a pole up for the person he hated, and Haman was the one who ultimately died on that pole. So, all I wanted to close with today is that when you hear this now, you would think, oh, awesome, the Jews are saved, the king knows that Esther is Jewish, Haman's gone, so everything is good, right? Wrong. The Jews are still legally have to be killed on March 7th in the following spring. Okay? 11 months from this time. I told you last week that once the king of Persia makes a law, they can't undo that law because it makes the king look like human and not like a god. So you can't undo this law. So the Jews already have a law that says they will be killed, slaughtered, and annihilated on March 7th of the following year. So they're not out of the woods. And next week, I'm going to close this story on the book of Esther with the exciting conclusion of God's deliverance. Okay? So you guys come back and we'll hear that, and then we'll review the whole thing. So as the worship team comes back up, let me go over those 3 little life points that I made. First, when your life is committed to God, like wholly surrendered to the Lord, then God determines your life's results. You don't have to worry about what God's will is in your life when you're committed to His work. Even if it is mysterious, even if it's a challenge, even if it's a trial, you don't have to say, God, I must have screwed something up really bad because I'm going through a trial. Well, sometimes it's the trial that is a part of God's plan for your life or the people's life around you. Lesson 2 was that fasting and prayer works. Probably going to do a series on fasting and prayer here in the near future. We'll talk about it in more detail. But Esther and Mordecai and hundreds of Jewish people or thousands of Jewish people, they didn't eat, they didn't drink for 3 days. They spent that time in prayer, and they begged God for mercy, and they begged God for deliverance. And God interceded in awesome, divine ways that you and I could never even begin to do. And when you would take that same seriousness into situations in your life, and you say, God, I'm going to starve my flesh, and I'm going to strengthen my spirit by spending that time in prayer, no matter what is coming up, you can rest assured that God is going to do amazing, divine things in your life. The last thing is that pride comes before the fall. If you're suffering with pride in your life, or if there's a people group or a person or something that is just consuming your anger and your hatred, you got to let that go. I'm telling you, you're going to dig a pit, and they're not going to be the ones that's going to fall into it. It's going to be you. You've got to be able to process that anger and that pride, especially as a Christian, because Jesus says, look, anybody can love only the people that love you. But it takes somebody special who can love somebody who hates you. That's the kind of attitude and the character that Christ had, and that's what He wants all of us to have. So as we close this morning, let's all stand up, and they're going to close with this song. And if any of that speaks to your heart today, if you say, God, this is what I need more of, then I'm just going to challenge you to come up front, drop to your knees, and say, Lord, please help me today. Help me be more like you and be more like Esther in this situation. And then we'll close with a word of prayer.